Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a piece of viral, highly polarizing online commentary that has sparked an absolutely intense debate. We're going to neutrally deconstruct this commentary, which makes some pretty sweeping claims about culture, crime, and the overall future of Western societies. By looking directly at the evidence, the quotes, and the specific arguments the host uses, we can understand exactly how these viral narratives are constructed. Now, remember, we aren't here to take sides. We're just here to unpack the mechanics of the argument. So, let's get right into it.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the video's core thesis, move into crime and justice failures, then tackle religious and cultural claims, shift over to demographics and institutions, and finally wrap up with the macro-civilization argument.
Section 1. The video's core thesis, a claim of incompatibility.
The entire foundation of this commentary actually rests on one massive assertion, that Western civilization and macro-Islam, along with certain immigrant cultures, are just fundamentally incompatible. I mean, listen to this direct quote from the host. He explicitly states, "If you want to be part of my society and my civilization, you either assimilate or leave." And that right there sets the rhetorical baseline for this whole explainer. The creator isn't arguing for multicultural integration, not at all. He's arguing that specific cultures are actively harmful to Western values and must either completely adapt or be removed. This very binary view of assimilation is the lens through which every single subsequent piece of evidence in the video is framed.
Moving right along to Section 2, Crime and Justice Failures. Anecdotes of a soft-on-crime system.
To really build up that sense of outrage, the source material leans super heavily into juxtaposition. On one hand, you've got severe, violent crimes. You have Fashihullah Safar, who attacked New Jersey police officers while allegedly shouting religious slogans, and Ahmed Mohammed Wahabi, who was convicted of a horrific sex attack on a child in the UK. But then, on the other hand, the host pairs these awful events with claims that the mainstream media just deliberately ignores them. He even argues that governments are actively protecting the perpetrators by housing them in taxpayer-funded hotels. The argument he's pushing here is that the state is entirely complicit through its inaction and silence. And this timeline perfectly illustrates the mechanical breakdown the host is trying to highlight. Take a look at the case of Dominique Shockey, arrested on May 18th for serious weapon and drug charges, released on a really low bond just weeks later on June 13th, and then, get this, commits an armed carjacking a mere 3 days later. The creator uses this exact timeline to visualize what he labels a complete soft-on-crime policy failure. He's arguing that the justice system actively prioritizes the release of dangerous individuals over everyday public safety.
Now, this systemic frustration basically boils over with a truly tragic case. Devin Lamar Anthony served only 11 months for a manslaughter charge, was released, and was subsequently charged with the murder of a pregnant 23-year-old mother. So, the crucial takeaway here is that the host uses this undeniable tragedy to express immense anger. He ultimately argues that early release policies are so fatally flawed that they actually justify extreme state responses, even going so far as to explicitly call for executions of repeat violent offenders. He frames all of this as a forced, terrifying reality imposed by a failing system.
All right, Section 3, Religious and Cultural Claims, Doctrines, and Interpretations.
Shifting gears from legal failures to cultural critiques, the video pulls in clips from a popular Islamic scholar named Zakir Naik. The criteria Naik outlines for forgiveness for major sins, including rape and murder, focus heavily on personal repentance. It's about admitting the wrong, stopping the action immediately, committing to never repeat it, and asking Allah for forgiveness. The commentator presents this to argue that the cultural framework prioritizes spiritual absolutions way above earthly justice and victim restitution.
And this builds into a seriously controversial argument about victimhood. Take this exact quote from Naik, where the scholar suggests that while a rapist is obviously to blame, a victim who didn't dress modestly is also undergoing a, quote, test. The commentator aggressively highlights this to argue that this specific cultural interpretation unfairly shifts the blame right onto female victims. He uses this snippet as hard evidence that importing this culture means importing a fundamental disrespect for women's rights and bodily autonomy.
Then, we shift from religious doctrine straight into bureaucratic appeasement. The number 375 pounds represents the weekly sum a British resident named Hassan allegedly receives in additional welfare. The host explains that because Britain recognizes overseas polygamous marriages, Hassan gets an extra 125 pounds per week for each of his 3 wives. The creator uses this precise figure to argue that Western governments aren't just tolerating, but actually actively subsidizing cultural practices that totally contradict traditional Western norms.
So you're probably asking, how does the video link these cultural practices to the actual physical policing of communities? Well, the host bridges this gap by pointing to localized institutions. For instance, he brings up a discussion regarding the Green Lane Mosque, where the technical religious justifications for extreme punishments, like stoning, are actively debated. The video frames these localized interpretations as a direct, imminent threat to domestic law and order.
Which brings us to Section 4, Demographics and Institutions, Shifting Landscapes in the UK.
To back up the claim that these cultural clashes are intensifying, the video points to some pretty rapid demographic shifts. Back in the 1960s, Birmingham had maybe 1 or 2 mosques. Today, over 200. He couples this statistic with footage of massive public street prayers. And why this matters for the host's argument is that he absolutely refuses to frame this as simply religious freedom or a natural demographic shift. Instead, he explicitly labels this growth and public presence as cultural domination.
And to argue that this isn't just some passive shift, the video actually maps out a specific political strategy based on a street interview. Step 1, gain local council representation. Step 2, elect Muslim members of parliament. And Step 3, utilize that concentrated voting bloc to influence the government to implement elements of Sharia law. The commentator uses this interview to drive home his point that the goal of these immigrant communities isn't integration at all, but rather an eventual legislative takeover.
Section 5. The Macro-Civilization Argument, Synthesizing the Rhetoric.
The host brings in political commentator Charlie Kirk to kind of formalize this whole macro argument. Kirk lays out 3 categorical incompatibilities between macro-Islam and the West: a lack of freedom of speech regarding religious criticism, a lack of freedom of religion, and a total rejection of the separation between mosque and state. The host uses Kirk's framework to categorically state that these 2 societal models literally cannot coexist in the same geographic space.
To show the friction this causes in the mainstream media, the video zeroes in on a really tense French television debate. On one side, you have a hard-right activist claiming the main danger to women in France specifically comes from immigrant men of African and Arab descent. The TV host counters this, stating the main danger to women is just men in general, regardless of their origin. The video's host expresses extreme frustration here, arguing that the TV host is deliberately muddying the waters to protect a failing immigration policy, all at the expense of public safety.
The stakes of this rhetoric are, frankly, incredibly high. The video shares a quote from that exact same French activist who actually faced jail time for her comments on television. She states, "The prosecutor has sought a prison sentence against me, yet all I did was describe a reality that most French people are afraid to speak about." The video utilizes this to construct a narrative of sheer persecution. The host frames legal pushback against anti-immigration rhetoric not as the enforcement of hate speech laws, but as state-sanctioned repression of the truth, designed specifically to silence native populations.
And that brings us to the end of our deconstruction. What you should really take away from this explainer is a clear understanding of how highly localized crimes, specific religious interpretations, and demographic data can be aggressively woven together into a single, unyielding narrative of civilizational conflict. It's like a giant puzzle where every piece is forced to fit a very specific picture. So, I'll leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. In our modern media landscape, when these elements are synthesized so powerfully, where exactly does the line fall between political commentary and ideological warfare? Thank you so much for focusing in with me today. Keep asking questions and keep learning.